program. Tonight's program is Trees Durham. I think you might find this quite interesting from a historical perspective in particular. Durham is known as a tree city, but you may not know how they got where they are. So we're going to learn about that tonight. So I want to welcome you all. Some of you are previous Durham Garden Forum members, or I will call you Durham Garden Forum members, and some of you have heard about this and have signed up, so welcome to you all. We're going to continue these programs via Zoom for the foreseeable future, and hopefully at some point in time we'll get back together. We do miss seeing each other live. We do miss our plant sharing table. We'll do that when we all feel safe coming together. We are going to record this session, and I'll get that sent out to the folks who are on this call. I don't plan to send it out broadcast fashion. If someone would like to receive it, they can let me know, but I will send it to all of the participants who signed up for this, this program. We will have a raffle. We have a gift certificate, an online gift certificate for Plant Delights, and Ashley will do a random selection from the participant list for those of you who sign in, and we'll give that away later tonight. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Katie Rose. Katie Rose is the executive director of Trees Durham. She's also an arborist. She knows trees. And she's in a really great spot right now relative to the impact she's having on our city. So without further delay, I want to turn it over to Katie Rose. I'm also going to ask you all to stay on mute while she is presenting. We often get some background noise sometimes that interferes with the presenter. So please stay on mute. If you have questions, please post them to the chat box, the Zoom chat box, which you can find if you're on a notebook or a PC at the bottom, and I think perhaps iPads or iPhones, it's up on the top. But go ahead and post your questions in the chat box, and we will address as many of these as we possibly can at the end of the presentation, and we'll also open it up at that time for live questions. So with that, Katie, we're going to turn it over to you.
Great. So thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to y'all. Like Jean said, I'm the executive director of Trees Durham. Trees Durham is a local environmental justice nonprofit working to address climate change by making our tree canopy healthy, sustainably, and socially just. So we look at everything we do through those three lenses of health, sustainability, and social justice. And that's why we're an environmental justice organization. Okay, so today I'm going to tell you the story about Durham's trees, about our trees, racism, and Durham's past and future. So although our story, this is where my slides are. So if you see me looking over there, it's because I'm going to check to make sure I'm on the right slide. So our story is going to begin in the 1930s, but I really want to take a minute to acknowledge the fact that prior to the Europeans arriving, there was this very thriving community of people who had been here for thousands of years. Our Native folks very actively managed the land. In fact, the forests and fields and plains and prairies that were here when the Europeans arrived were beautiful. They were managed like gardens. And in many ways, they were as much of a built environment as the city that we lived in today. So the Native Americans burned to maintain grazing for the buffalo that we have here. And they did a lot of other like very important, very, very smart, technically savvy and pretty cool techniques. So the Europeans arrived and basically killed, kidnapped, and enslaved the Native Americans and did their best to eradicate their culture, took over their land, clear-cut everything, and started farming in a very different way. So I do want to sort of name the tribes that were here and now are currently here. So in this area, the Siouan tribe, the Siouan communities, and particularly the Saponi, were in sort of this area. And within the Saponi, there were a bunch of associated bands, such as the Okinichi. You might have heard of Okinichi Mountain, the Eno River, the Tutilo, and then also the Saponi related to other types of Native American tribes, such as the Cherokee. And I'm going to tell you right now, I often pronounce things poorly, and I am sure that I pronounced many of those incorrectly. So I'm asking for your patience and forgiveness as I do my best to learn. What you're looking at now is an emblem from the newsletter that is sent out by the Okinichi tribe that is currently today living in Hillsborough and the surrounding communities, and they're working on rebuying back some of their native lands to help establish their culture, their cultural management of the land, and other such things. So let's start with this idea that Durham was something, and then Europeans came and now have overlaid something completely different on top of that. So it's kind of started from scratch in a lot of ways, and everything that we have is deliberate. So with that, so our story starts in the 1930s. At the time, Durham's population was increasing rapidly. It was spurred on by both tobacco mills and regular cloth mills. NC Central, Duke University, the new Watts Hospital, and there was also another hospital over in like the Haiti area. So there was both a black and a white hospital. So it was a very bustling, prosperous towns. So in the late 1920s and early 1930s, two major programs emerged that pertain to Durham's tree history. The first program was a national program called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC. This program was a federally sponsored program, and the whole purpose of it was to increase home ownership and civic investment in desirable areas. So to help pull people out of the depression, get them houses, get them home loans, get some infrastructure going, make cities more livable. The second was a city group called Durham's Tree Commission. So this group was part of a larger city movement across Durham to help promote tree planting and care, primarily for beautification and shape. First, though, we're going to start with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the group that was really pushing home ownership, because that really sets the stage for everything else that has happened in Durham. All right, so after the 1920s, the federal government saw home ownership as an important mechanism for recovering from the Depression and creating civilian wealth. So to promote home ownership, the New Deal created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. What this did was help realtors, mortgage lenders, banks, and landowners divide cities across the United States into categories. These categories were A, B, C, and D, and they were based on how desirable a neighborhood was. The more desirable a neighborhood, the easier it was for someone to get a loan and buy a house there. So if you lived in a neighborhood, very desirable, very easy to get loans, and they were very cheap, low interest rates. If you lived in a D neighborhood, very undesirable, you probably couldn't get a home loan there at all. And if you could, it would be so expensive, such high cost to buy the loan that it functionally didn't exist. So the problem with this is that these categories of A, B, C, and D were explicitly based on race. So white neighborhoods in cities and counties were given A ratings and easy loans and lots of encouragement to buy and own homes. And African-American neighborhoods in the South were given D ratings and blocked from any home ownership in that area at all. So these are the different homeowners. This is the map showing grades of security. So this map is what was drawn by the Homeowners Loan Corporation for Durham, and it should look pretty familiar to you as it almost perfectly matches many of the neighborhoods we have today. Jean, can you nod if you can see my mouse moving around? Or say yes? Yes, thank you, Ashley.
Yes,
So
yes,
this is,
yeah, we can.
thank you. So this is Trinity Park right here, this green zone. It got an A rating, it's highly desirable. And so I'm gonna read out, when they made these maps, they had to justify, it was a federal government, so they had to write out, why is this an A thing? So I'm gonna actually quote what was written on the maps. And I apologize in advance because they used racist language because it was a racist program. So they classified Trinity Park as A, highly desirable, because it was, quote, not Negro, and, quote, filled with college professors, professionals, business executives. So therefore, it was easy if you were white to get a home loan there. But you could not move there if you were Black. In fact, real estate agents wouldn't even bring you to that part of the city. The South Side neighborhood and Hayti neighborhood, which is this community down here, got a D rating. It was classified as, quote, Negro. And the HOLC justified their rating by writing in part that, quote, this was formerly a good white residential street, but Negroes are gradually taking up the neighborhood. So few to no loans were given out in these D neighborhoods in Durham, even though they were the only places available for non-whites to live, which means that this program created haves and have-nots by making it so only white people could get home loans and only in neighborhoods where white people lived. And Black folks and people of color, so this actually included those of Asian descent out west, could not get homeowners, could not get home loans, could not buy or own homes, and could not move into neighborhoods that had wealth. So these maps and the access to home loans that they created, they resulted in pockets of poverty and wealth based explicitly on race. And more to the point of this presentation, they also got an investment in essential city amenities, such as trees and parks. So now you know about why there are concentrations of white and wealthy places and communities of color who don't have that wealth. Let's talk about trees. I wish I could see your faces because I'm such like a face person, so I'm gonna assume you're all nodding along with me. Thanks, Ashley. I did want to pause to give you a second. So one thing to note is, so these maps were due in the 1920s. These are the way that Durham is divided today. So this is Trinity Park. This is Trinity Park. This right here is Walltown. This right here is Walltown. This area is sort of Old West Watts Hillendale. You can see that. Down here, we have Southside, Hayti. This is Southside, the neighborhood I live in. This is Hayti, East Durham, East Durham. So if you Google Durham hoods, the map on the right will show up, and this is how neighborhood associations are broken up. Trees. All right. So in the late 1920s, Duke University commissioned the famous Olmsted Landscape Architecture Group to help design their campus. So the Olmsteds also designed things like the Yellowstone Welcome Center, New York Central Park, the Biltmore Estate. So these were like a pretty big, important group of folks. And they also helped design like a general sense of parks for Durham. And then in 1930s, Duke University hired the nationally recognized Clarence Korstian, who's the dude on the left, to be the first dean of the School of Forestry. So he came, helped establish Duke Forest on a bunch of degraded farmland. And then he also became really heavily interested in the beautification and tree planting across Durham. So he advocated for a street tree program across Durham City. Taking a cue from this advocacy, the Durham Garden Club began to advocate for more tree planting and city investment in green spaces in general. So at this point, it was led by a civic activist, Margaret Brawley, and the Garden Club, led by Margaret, demanded the city invest and support tree plantings across the city. So a cool story about Margaret Brawley. She was very active in her church, and she was such a strong figure that when the city was dragging their feet on doing investment in parks and street tree planting, she actually held a sit-in at City Hall to demand. So civil action for trees is a long-standing tradition in Durham. So as a result of all this activism, Durham created the Tree Commission to establish an urban forest across the city. And in 1933, the guy on the left, Korstian, was named the Tree Commissioner. As a tree commissioner, Korstian declared willow oaks to be the tree of choice for Durham and created planting and maintenance standards for the city's growing urban forestry effort. So all of the willow oaks across the city, we have them because this man right here was like, this is a great tree. And in fact, he was right. They have done really well for us. So I did want to say something about this. Come back, maybe. So this is an example of all the different neighborhoods that sorted themselves based on those 1920s maps. So Ragtown is a historically African-American community that was established by when enslaved people were freed and walked over away from the place of enslavement to create their own city. Walltown, I don't know if it's on here, where the African-Americans who worked in the hospitals and the university, surrounded, of course, by the professors and such who did that. So all of these organizations got together, joined on the bandwagon to advocate for city planting of trees. Of course, it wasn't all even. So once these neighborhood associations were established, they demanded the city plant trees in front of their houses and along their streets. And it worked. So all told, there were about 13,000 trees planted in the 1930s. Trees were planted through a combination of private efforts, city investments, and the Work Progress Administration, or WPA. Well, where do you think there was no such investment in tree planting during this time? It was in the areas marked undesirable by HOLC maps, defined specifically by the presence of African Americans. So these maps that you're looking at right now are tree planting maps from the 1937, so forgive me for the fact that they're a little bit blurry, but they show how stark the disparity was between tree plantings in white neighborhoods versus Black neighborhoods. So white neighborhood on the left, Trinity Park that I pointed out earlier, all those red numbers are the number of trees that were planted that year on each city block. So you can see Monmouth is 20, Trinity is 23, and then the one on the right is Hayti, that Hayti neighborhood that was a D neighborhood, and there are no trees planted there. So lots of tree investment. Remember, these are the big willow oaks in white neighborhoods. No tree investment in Black neighborhoods. So how does this translate into what we see today? Computer, tell us. There we go. Okay, so this is a general map of Durham based on 2010 census blocks. It shows, so the census blocks are very tightly linked to those HOLC maps, because even today, the way we take our census is based on racial redlining practices or racial practices from the 1920s. So this shows canopy cover in those census blocks or in those neighborhoods. So the darker the green, the more trees, the darker the red, the less trees, right? Canopy cover is just another way of saying shade. So if you have 50% canopy cover, that means every other step you take is in the shade. If you have 10% canopy cover, it means 9 out of 10 steps are in the sun. And if you have 90% canopy cover, it means only 1 out of 10 steps you take is in the sun. So more canopy, more shade. And something that's very important is the benefits of shade that we'll talk about in a little bit really kick in once you have 30% canopy cover. So you get the full benefits of trees when 2 out of 3 steps you take is under the shade of a tree. So you can see that the neighborhoods that were redlined have very low canopy cover, less than 30%, while those neighborhoods that had that tree planting in the 1920s today have up to 80%, at least more than 50% canopy cover. So that's pretty stark. So comparing these maps to, so another way of doing this, another way of looking at this is how can we compare the redlining and canopy cover? So this is another way of looking at that map before. So the green are the A's and the reds are the D's. So A, B, C, D, which is most white to most African-American from the 20s. And then the darker the green, the more canopy cover. The difference here is what is just overall a canopy cover. So if you were to take a Google map and just draw circles around the trees, how many trees would be there? Versus the stripe is what is specifically the trees that the city is paying to maintain, right? And so that shows you a difference between private amenities and public investment. So it's the difference between, do you have a sidewalk in front of your house or do you have a driveway leading up to your door, right? So your driveway is a private investment and a sidewalk is a public investment. So you can see the difference between private and public investments in trees in Durham is even greater than these maps show. So I will answer your question in just a second, Wanda. So in the D areas in Durham, even in places that might have on average 50% canopy cover, the actual canopy investment in these traditionally African-American communities is dismal. It's less than 20%. So it's a pretty big difference in what the city has invested, the amenities that the city has put into African-American communities, both from the 20s and even from today. So I do want to point out that this isn't something that just happened in Durham. This happened all across the country. Remember how I told you that this was a federal program that went to all major cities? Well, these tree planting events and these tree planting pushes followed those redlining practices, the racist redlining practices, all across the country to result in the same thing. So Durham has a very big spread. Fresno has the same thing, Pittsburgh, Portland, St. Louis, Richmond, and Baltimore. No matter where you live in the United States, if you are an African American, you are living in a place that has fewer trees because in the 1920s, the federal government created racially motivated, racially dictated home loan maps, right? So this is racist redlining. This is how decisions that were racist that were made in the 1920s have impacts on tree canopy cover for people living in cities today. That just like blows my mind. Wanda, this answers your question a little bit. This is kind of complicated, but I think it's really worth looking at because I find data interesting and I'm trying to show it to you in a lot of different ways. So this is on the bottom today. This is so based on the last census. I hope you fill out your census form. Based on the last census, this is the proportion of non-white people living in a space. So here, 90% of the people living on this line, or I guess in this line here, are going to be white. Over here, 90% to 100% would be non-white today for these different census blocks. The dots are the 1920s shapes that I showed you, right? So in the 1920s, these areas were the ones that were drawn in red that were primarily African-American, and today, these areas are still primarily African-American. There's been a little bit more movement in the green and blue, whereas the ones up here were all white in the 1920s, and you can see there's a little bit more mixing, although not a ton today. What this line shows you is percent canopy cover. So even as people have moved and changed, you can see if you are living in a predominantly white neighborhood today, you still have significantly more canopy cover than if you are living in a predominantly African-American community today. So there it is. So this is the story of Durham. Oh, and this is another way of looking at that same information. This is Forest Hills, which is a traditionally white community. This was classified, I think as A or B, I don't remember right off, but you can see just looking at a Google map how much forest there are. This is that South Side neighborhood, the Hayti neighborhood. You can see how few trees there are. So another way of looking at the same idea. 90 years later, poverty and prosperity, and defined by maps in the 1930s, remains mostly unchanged. Tree canopy is lowest and poverty is the highest in those areas labeled undesirable during by the HOLC, which were written down as our communities of color. So this is Durham's history. In the 1930s, non-white residents were boxed out of getting home loans and the associated wealth of owner-occupied neighborhoods. While white residents could obtain loans for houses, they were able to create concentrated neighborhoods of wealth, which then allowed them to advocate for tree planting and other type of city investment. This led to trees being planted in white neighborhoods and not in traditionally African-American neighborhoods. These trees have now grown up, creating a patchwork of canopy cover across Durham. And this results in the environmental injustice we see today, where historically white communities have trees and historically communities of color and communities of color today do not. This also sets up conditions for structural racism. where people who are not racist unwittingly perpetuate racist practices because they're acting without considering the broader historical context of their actions. And so this was the first time that I really understood what structural racism is, because I am a tree person and everyone has to learn sometime, and this is how I learned. So this is a map of trees that were planted by the city of Durham between 2007 and 2014, before all the information I just presented to you was compiled and put together in a way that I just presented it, right? So it's sort of out there, but the storyline wasn't understood or created. So it says save to this PC, just ignore that. So what you're seeing now, every black dot is a single tree that was planted over 7 years. So what I want to say about this map is these trees were planted by our urban forester who fundraised for them because there wasn't a dedicated city budget per se. And then on nights and weekends worked with one of our nonprofits, Keep Durham Beautiful, to plant these trees because he believed that that was the right thing to do and she believed this was the right thing to do. So we got trees planted because people really thought that they should be planted and they were absolutely right. But where they were planted was basically based on citizen requests. So if you wanted a tree, you could call up and get one, or where trees were dying. So it makes sense, right? If you have a tree die, you replace it. If you have a cracked sidewalk, you repair it. But you only request trees if you know how to, and you only get trees replaced if you already have one. So if you actually look at where trees were planted based on those 1930s redlining zones, the same map I keep showing you, you can see the numbers are just like those 1930s maps that were based on race. 419 trees planted in A, Trinity Park, 0 planted in Hayti, 0 planted down here. A, this is Forest Hills again, right? I think it's Forest Hills. 135 trees planted here. 2 planted down here, 3 planted down here. So it's a huge disparity because you can't repair an infrastructure that isn't in place. So without knowing the history, good people were perpetuating and setting up the situation that going into the future, communities of color still wouldn't have tree canopy. Just those maps again. So what did we do? We researched it, we learned about this, and then we started advocating to change it. So the city realized that what they were doing was unjust, and they've changed what they were doing. So what you see here is a new inventory of trees in Durham. The green spots are trees that are currently there, and the purple dots are empty tree planting places, so places that need trees that don't have them currently. So the city created a tree management plan, and as part of that tree management plan, they integrated this information about environmental racism and tried to be more anti-racist, which means in order to create a more equitable tree canopy, they had to put 80%, or they've decided to put 80% of their new tree plantings in these areas that never had trees to begin with. And then the other 20, they are using to replace infrastructure, right? So this is what it looks like to be...
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to put this on speaker. No, not everything, babe, wait. This is fascinating.
I'm glad that you think so. I think you accidentally came off of mute though. All right. I love Zoom. There's nothing that delights me more than hearing people's lives and family and seeing cats and dogs and kids. So I digress a little bit. So this is what it looks like to help address environmental racism. And this is what it looks like to help create environmental justice, is learning about the injustice of the plants of the past and creating a more equitable future through investing more in communities that have always had invested less. Makes sense? The time frame is they are planning on planting about 15,000 trees over 10 years. So remember, the original tree planting was 13,000 trees. So they're basically redoing this practice, but almost like a redo it in a more just way. And this is actually a direct result of advocacy. So it's a result of research from Duke University, advocacy from people who helped start TreesDurham, and a willingness of good people working in government to really address things head on to try to make them better. So I give a lot of credit both to the citizens and the government and the people working in government to try to work on this head on. So what? Why does this matter and why are trees important? And I know I'm talking to the Durham Garden Forum, so I'm a little bit preaching to the choir, but you know what? You gotta preach to the choir to sing, right? And then also, if we teach each other songs, we can go out and sing to other people in language that they understand. Trees are not nice. I mean, they are really nice, but they're not just nice. They're actually essential infrastructure. They're technology. They provide benefits that are needed for Durham's residents, particularly in the context of climate change, air pollution, and increase in development. So we're going to look at some key examples. Probably the most important thing from a human perspective is that trees are giant air filters. So I really like this picture because what trees do is they pull pollution out of the air and then provide us back with clean air. The other thing they do is they lower heat. So these two go together. While they're cleaning the air, so anytime a car drives by, it is putting out pollution, and that pollution is toxic and will kill you, right? There's actually corridors of death that, they're called corridors of death by people who do public health, that surround highways, because if you live within a certain distance of a highway and you don't have trees there, you are fully exposed to the heavy metals and rubbers and all the things that come off, causes a bunch of different health impacts that I'll tell you about. Trees are essential for that. They also mitigate heat. So what you're looking at right now is a thermograph, which is just thermo, heat graph picture. So it is a heat picture of a downtown courtyard in New York City. So you can see the temperatures on the right. The hotter colors, so the brighter colors, are the hotter temperatures. So 90 degrees is what we're seeing on these buildings. And this rock here, also 90, almost 100 degrees from where the sun is hitting it. Look at the trees, right? The trees are more 70 degrees. Trees are incredibly cooling. In this picture alone, you can see that having trees around is cooling the temperatures about 20 degrees. Heat kills more people in the United States than all other natural disasters combined. So more people die of heat every year than die of floodings, tornadoes, fires, earthquakes. Cannot remember all of the natural disasters, murder wasps combined. I don't think murder wasps are actually a natural disaster. And most people who die of heat actually die inside because they can't afford air conditioning or their air conditioning doesn't work sufficiently. So heat is a killer. Having trees around, lowering your temperature inside your house from 90 to 70 degrees is the difference between life and death for many, many people. So imagine if you're in the community of color and you don't have those trees and you can't afford air conditioning. This is a big health hazard. This causes death disproportionately to our communities of color who do not have trees. So vulnerable communities in Durham have to deal with more heat. If you live in a community that doesn't have trees, you have higher instances of asthma, strokes, heart attacks. You pay more for medical bills. You miss 4 more days of work and your kids miss 4 more days of school, specifically due to air pollution and heat-related illness. These are all, besides like the physical impact that the trees have on you, they also all are expensive. Every day you miss at work, if you are an hourly worker, is a day you don't get paid. Every time you have to go to the hospital or take your kid to the hospital, not only do you miss work, but then you have to pay for the medications and the healthcare. So this hurts you physically and it also hurts you economically. And there's also the cultural aspect. So trees are particularly good for kids, and particularly good for kids in a learning context. Kids who go to school and live, work, and play around trees have lower instances of ADD and ADHD. They report less bullying. You see less bullying on the playground. And they're actually even correlated with an increase in math skills. There's some really cool research coming out of the University of Chicago that looks at that. So really, really important. Also, they're good for communities. Communities that have a really robust tree canopy have less crime, particularly violent crime. So domestic abuse, assaults, murders, things like that. They have more community cohesion. So residents report feeling more close to their neighbors, more comfortable being out in the streets, having their kids play in the streets and things like that. So it is both actual crime numbers are less, and then also the feeling of safeness is more, probably related. If you own a business, so if you're one of those businesses downtown where there are street trees, people come twice as often, they'll spend more money for the same goods at your stores. So very good for the economy. There are big Black-owned community centers in Southside that don't have any trees, so they're actually getting sort of a treeless tax because people perceive of that shopping experience to be less valuable, so they'll pay less for it. I would be amiss talking to a garden forum if I didn't mention that trees are extremely amazing for pollinators. A native oak can support over 20 different species of caterpillars. Caterpillars grow up into pollinators, such as moths and butterflies. So big trees are really good for pollinators, they're huge mechanisms of biodiversity from the times that they're seedlings and establishing associations with fungus and bugs, bacteria in the soil, all the way through supporting birds and bees and butterflies as living creatures to supporting fungi as they die. So they are amazing. And then of course, climate change. Trees are the best mechanism we have of drawing down carbon. So I like to think of climate change in sort of a pretty violent way, and I apologize in advance. Sort of like getting hit by a car and bleeding on the pavement. That is climate change, right? So we're losing all this blood as we just emit carbon into the atmosphere. So we have to stop emitting carbon to address climate change, period. And then what trees are is they're like the bags of blood to put the carbon back in, right? And so trees are really good at drawing carbon out of the atmosphere and holding it. And the nice thing about them as a climate change technology is they provide all the other benefits I told you. So some of the other technologies we have to like remove carbon from the air do just one thing, which is removing carbon. Trees do all these other things. So there are so many more benefits, and I'd be delighted to talk more about them. But suffice it to say that trees are essential technologies that make residents of Durham happy, healthy, and wealthy. And this is why trees matter. And right now, trees in Durham are providing these benefits to primarily white, wealthy, and established neighborhoods, while communities of color and new developments bear the brunt of environmental injustice, treeless streets filled with pollution, heat stress, and health stress, and all of the costs that come along with that. So trees are really important, and they're not evenly distributed, and we need to do something about that. Even where we do have trees, they're dying off. So this is a map that looks a little bit different than one we've looked at. Same HOLCs, but this shows a decrease in canopy cover. So the neighborhoods that have the most trees are actually also losing the most trees, right? So Trinity Park has lost about 20% of their trees in 4 years because of all those willow oaks dying off, right? Basically everywhere in Durham is losing trees because of development, and these trees are old. They've been hit by cars, repaving. So we need to start planting more trees. And then just as a reminder, but we can't just plant to replace. We need to plant to also improve. I wanted to add in these charts. This is a little bit new research. This is charts. Question, could trees be a building required for new development? That is actually being voted on today. And instead of being at that vote, I'm presenting to you lovely people. So yes, they can be a building requirement for new developments, and we're working on that with TreesDurham. What you're seeing here is an extreme heat priority score. So any place that is red is where Durham is right now experiencing extreme heat. So downtown neighborhoods, sort of the historic communities of color, also South Square, South Point Mall, Duke University, and Bragtown. So Bragtown is going to be a historically African-American neighborhood, as well as sort of these areas. Duke University, very, very urban, no trees, very, very hot. You can kind of see West Campus there, right? All the buildings on the quad. South Square, very hot. South Point Mall. This is air quality. So these are areas of low air quality based on EPA and major highways. And those are those corridors of death I told you about, where if there are no trees, you're going to have a very high amount of exposure to air pollution. This is also made up of air monitors picking up diesel fuel emissions. So you can see sort of in our more urbanized area, there's just a lot more heat. A couple other things trees do is they help stop flooding. So the darker the blue, the more issues Durham has with flooding. So you can see the streams on there. Allerby Creek Watershed is one of our most urbanized places. So lowest canopy cover, most hardscapes, hard surfaces, also called impervious surface, highest risk of flooding. And then I told you it helps reduce violent crime. So you can see this is where Durham has the most violent crime. This does not include the summer of violence from the summer, but previously, so this is where we need more trees and often where we don't have it. So We don't know why trees are related to a reduction in violent crime, but when you hold everything else the same across the United States, if you have trees, you have less violent crime, even if all of the other social factors are the same. So what do we do? Well, we know this and then we act. So this is tree giveaways. So TreesDurham is working with community groups to give away trees into communities that might not have it. So we're targeting, for example, Durham Free Lunch. We're working with them to give away trees to DPS students who are getting free lunch through there. We're working hopefully with Lincoln Community Center, El Centro, Lakeview Park. So we're doing a bunch of tree giveaways this year. We're also doing tree plantings, and we're doing tree plantings with communities. So this is over at the Southside community. We don't just go out and plant trees. We actually ask the communities if they want them. And some people do and some people don't. And this is with Hillside High School and some other neighborhoods. So very, very fun to go out and plant trees. That helps restore the issues of the past, right? So remember, we want the city to invest in city public infrastructure, but we also want to help private infrastructure, private people. We also need to advocate for the future. What we have on the left is an ideal tree canopy cover if we wanted to have a, if we wanted to say all across Durham, 50%, every other step you take is in the shade. This is about where we would need to preserve trees. On the right, this is where we're actually preserving trees. So the right is by law, if someone wanted to, they could cut all of this down. So the only part that is protected in Durham by law are the green parts. Everything else is unprotected legally. So we need to advocate for better legislation to require developers and perhaps even require private people to protect their trees and keep them during development. So that is a big thing that we're doing is we don't just want to plant trees to stop, to fix past inequalities. We also want to build a future that has trees and forests for future communities in an equitable way. And that means we do a lot of talking to these fine fellas and ladies and other people who are on city council. So we write, we work with them, we advocate. It's extremely important. So I just spent like 40 minutes talking about trees and racial history. And what I would like to ask for you is to take this and decide what piece really inspires you. If it's tree planting, if it's advocacy, if it's working with neighbors, if it's just talking about it and educating yourself and others. So with that, I'll stop and take some questions. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to share this with you.
Katie Rose, can you comment on what types of trees are replacing trees that are dying out? What types of trees are going into the areas that have been underserved in the past? What species of trees are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's also a really complicated question. So in areas that don't have trees, the city is planting the trees that they can purchase from the nurseries that will fit in the space. So in the nursery trade, for the longest time, non-native trees were sort of they're quick to grow, they're easy to grow, and they can survive anything, especially people who don't know how to plant trees. So we've gotten a lot of things like ginkgos, which are pretty trees. We've gotten lacebark elms, we've gotten different types of maples, and so those have gone on. The urban forester who's now for general services, I can't remember his official title, which is sad because he totally deserves it, but he really liked interesting trees. So there's actually some endangered trees planted in Duke Park along the road that he just got from somebody, which is pretty cool. So it's really a big mix based on what's available in for purchase from the nursery, because we have to compete with all the landscapers for the trees. In fact, that's one of the challenges I have at TreesDurham. TreesDurham has been working with Ellery Creek Watershed Association, New Hope Audubon Society, and the North Carolina Invasive Plant Council to help update the landscape manual, which tells developers what they can and can't plant. We've been doing that with Dan Jewell's group, Surface 678, some other landscape architects, and that's coming. We just did that. And so we're trying to get rid of the invasive species and promote more native species. So that is an evolving thing. that is happening right now as part of our advocacy. And yeah, so I could throw out some more species, but it's just really all over the place, from oaks and maples and sycamores and lindens to Japanese maples and trident maples and lacebark elms and other things.
So it looks like we have a couple questions in the chat too. Is this a good time for that, Jean?
Sure, go ahead.
So one question we have from Jane Hewitt. Does Chapel Hill have restrictions on cutting trees on a certain size on private property? Is there an avenue Durham might consider for something like that?
Yeah, so I don't remember offhand if Chapel Hill restricts cutting trees of a certain size on private property just in general. Chapel Hill during development does have better protection for large trees than Durham does during development. So, the way that our regulations work in North Carolina is we really only regulate things during development. And part of that is because the state legislature has passed so many laws preventing Durham from doing things like requiring affordable housing or requiring types of tree preservation. In fact, last year, the state tried to pass a law that would ban tree protection at all. So we beat that back thanks to a lot of volunteers at TreesDurham and across the state. Cary does protect trees of a certain size. Durham in buffers, sorry, I got a mosquito bite, does protect trees of a certain size in buffers. Other states in the country protect trees of a certain size, period, or certain species. Like even South Mississippi, you can't cut down live oaks, right? Because they're considered heritage trees. So there is an avenue that Durham has an opportunity to consider. And I think it's a good one to consider. I also am aware that sometimes people get really dicey about private property. And so people feel like it's my tree. I would say that if a tree is 200 years old, then perhaps it is more of a tree that belongs to the land. And that is the attitude, or because of all the public amenities that these larger trees in particular provide, a lot of cities regulate them as a public good in the same way they regulate stormwater, sidewalks, or things like that. So, yes. I don't have a strong answer about that right now. I think that is a complicated question.
Fair enough. What has the city council done to support tree planting in historically underserved areas?
Yeah, so that's really complicated too, right? They have not fully funded the urban forestry plan. And so Keep Durham Beautiful has been working to fundraise so that the city can actually even just plant those 13,000 trees. So if you are looking for a place to donate to plant trees in historically underserved neighborhoods, you can donate to me, to TreesDurham, or Keep Durham Beautiful. I mean, you can give me money. I go out and plant trees all the time, but Keep Durham Beautiful is helping fundraise to put those in there. City Council is supportive of these. I think that one of the reasons why I spend so much time talking about the health benefits to trees is because some people have this idea that trees are like nice or only white people want trees. And it is helpful when more people go to elected officials or talk to people to say, trees aren't just nice, trees are important for health, they're important for justice, they're important for crime. And so the more different types of people and the more time City Council says that, the more supportive they are of this type of tree planting.
Yeah, I think sorry, I just think that's an amazing way to frame it. I mean, I think it's actually the truth, right? These things are not just because they're nice. Mm-hmm. Okay, what about more parks or requiring green space for all development?
Yeah, that's a big
on this.
I have a lot of strong opinions on this. I think that, so actually, historically, Durham has had a pretty racist park distribution as well. So not surprisingly, when the park system was established in the, I can't remember the dates wrong. I think in the 60s, they had I wrote this down for another class I taught. What it comes down to is a lot of the black parks were established on like firmware dumps or incinerator sites. So even when they did provide parks, this was at the time during Jim Crow, and it was segregated. the African-American communities got worse parks. In fact, a survey that went out 3-4 years ago, people of color, white folks tended to want more parks, and the people of color who responded tended to want the parks that they had better maintained. So I think that we should require developers to put in more parks, period. We should have a master plan of linked greenway systems like Cary does. Cary is way better and way ahead of us in that way, and that is a justice issue. Recently, Durham considered allowing developers who are doing low-income housing to eliminate green space, and we pushed that back because that is racist. Doesn't matter how rich you are, you should have green space. So in a lot of the neighborhoods that are protesting some of these rezoning cases like Ragtown and Merrickmore are specifically asking for parks and green space to prevent flooding and to allow their kids to play, and because of heat issues they're already dealing with. So like our communities of color and us, we know that we need parks, and we know that we need to preserve the environment. We are working to change the culture within Durham City, which is a culture of we need development at all costs. So what we need is not any development, we need good, just, environmentally right development. So I'm a big fan of asking more from our development community, and we have good developers. We also are attracting we're also attracting the 7th largest developer in the United States as 2 different massive developments up for rezoning now. So, I think there's a really great opportunity for us, and we're already making a difference. So this is one avenue of opportunity to expand the impact that we have for our future generations.
So I see 2 more. One of them is a longer comment, but I think it gets to this point of some types of trees can actually lead to increased air pollution near the road. And so basically mixed effects of trees near roads, and some guidance from EPA on that. And so I was just wondering if you had any, I don't know.
Thoughts?
Yeah.
So there's actually a pretty big debate in the scientific community about that, because there are a lot of the studies that show, so there are 2 things. One is, do trees emit things that can cause air pollution? The answer is absolutely yes. Anyone who has seasonal allergies would know that if you are allergic to oaks, when the oak is pollinating out, you will get allergies, right? Climate change is increasing that issue. It is not just for trees, but ragweed everywhere. Because of we have North Carolina is going to have warmer and wetter seasons, which will lead to an increased pollen count. So that will, if you're allergic to pollen, that's going to be a challenge for you. That is one of the downsides. Trees are not perfect. I am not perfect. I hope you still want me around. So the benefits outweigh, I think, the downsides for the most part. Other types of pollutants that trees emit are they're basically, the Blue Ridge Parkway. The reason it's blue is because of the chemicals that trees emit and the way the light refracts through it, right? So those chemicals can combine with other types of pollutants that we emit to create pollution, right? So trees can help generate some ground level ozone creatures that emit stuff. Most of the research on the, I think, show that is more valuable on the balance. You are more healthy. So if you look at, I hope you can still hear me. It looks like my internet is going through. Okay. If you look at the balance, like if you look at a tree and you're like, okay, this tree is emitting something, you can say that, yes, that tree is emitting something. If you look at the research of how trees are impacting public health over time, it is consistently positive. So that's one. The other thing is there are some models that show that if you have a canopy like this over a road, that it can capture air pollution, right? Because it can't get through. Most of those models are just that, they're models, and they model trees as not actually absorbing anything. So it's basically they're modeling canopies that are over the roads that function like putting cloth over the road. We know that trees actually intake things and move things around. So there is some debate within the scientific community about how valid modeling is without actual ground proofing. I tend to think it's probably both correct. I think that it is, I think it really sciencey on you. The net impact seems to be positive when you look at the public health value. And that partly is because ground level ozone is generated by heat plus air pollution, and ground level ozone just literally melts your lungs and is so damaging to you that if you have cooler streets that have less ozone, it is better, even if you have a little bit more pollution. But that's going to differentiate. Are you standing beside like my neighborhood road where I'm having mostly cars, or are you standing beside like a major thoroughfare, like maybe Roxborough Road, where there's a lot of trucks that are emitting heavy metals from diesel fuel, things coming off of their trucks, lots of rubber, your tires wear down, that rubber goes somewhere, it goes into the air and you breathe it in. So I think it's going to be very site specific. Just on the whole, street trees provide just proven benefits. And also, the world is complicated.
Yeah, so I think we'll do one last, just because I know it's like the perennial question in Durham. The average lifespan of Durham's willow oaks around 100 years, and it seems like we'll lose most of them in the next decade. So kind of just a like, oh no, the willow oaks question.
Oh no, the willow oaks. Yeah, so willow oaks are rock stars. They grow fast, make a big slub hash, and die young. And they wouldn't die so young if we didn't beat them up by cutting their roots and running into them and all this stuff. So yes, and Jan pointed this out, and I'm going to actually read this verbatim. It's so important to clearly point out that we are being impacted by the choices people made 100 years ago, right? So those 100-year-old oaks were because people 100 years ago planted them for us. So what we do now is going to impact the next 100 years, right? So we're at an inflection point in Durham's history where that investment that was made 100 years ago has paid off, and now it is time for us to reinvest for the next 100 years. And how we do that is going to shape the feeling, the health, and the justice of our community. And trees are my thing. They're an excellent way of creating a socially just, healthy, happy, safe community for the next 100 years if we do it, because it costs money and it takes time. And we can do it. They did it 100 years ago, and we can do it today for the next generations. So I hope you're inspired.
That's great. All right. Well, I thank you very much, Katie, for this presentation. It's very thought-provoking. I think we all have things we can do to advocate. We have yards to plant trees in. So you've given us plenty to think about. I'd like to mention that our raffle winner tonight is Lee Mullen, and I will send Lee the gift certificate for tonight's raffle. Congratulations, Lee. And I'd also like to comment to you that next month we are going to focus on hostas. So we've talked about trees. Trees create shade. Well, we have a plant that we can plant in shade called hosta. And we're going to concentrate on that for next week's talk. By the way, I received a really, really excellent email from Kate Ridenour with some really good suggestions on topics for future programs. And we are going to use those kinds of inputs as we shape programs going forward. We are in the process of putting together programs for the March through July time period of 2021. So any of you who have ideas and suggestions or comments, please pass them along. You all have my email address. It's very helpful. We think we are hitting the mark, but without your feedback, we don't know for sure. So really appreciate it, Kate, and look forward to other feedback from others. So thank you very much, and look forward to talking to you via Zoom next month. Katie, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Hi, everyone.
Bye-bye.